Okay. Well, again, I'm Steve Richter, and I work for the Nature Conservancy in the state of Wisconsin. And my role with the nonprofit is working with on agricultural projects, such as an example, the one today with working with you all. And as this slide illustrates, our primary role, which Todd alluded to, is providing financial support for cost share programs or other activities the group has done for the past 3 years. And as I think will be illustrated in the following slides, we're really happy with the outcomes your organization is putting forward. I also try to help out by providing some advice or ideas and putting together the annual conservation survey, and the presentation tonight is an example of that. Next slide, Jamie. So the next slide illustrates, and again, I apologize for the small font. I put this together this morning because it illustrates the tally of the conservation survey from 2020, with which 46 of the farmers in your organization filled out this year. And I was busy this morning sort of tallying up the figures that are on this slide. And in doing so, I compare those to the figures from 2019, which are on the left-hand side of this slide. And I've taken a subset of the conservation practices that were on that survey and have put them on the slide. And so these practices are examples. Some of the practices tied to fertilizing, variable rate nitrogen stabilizers, nutrient management planning. Then I turn to practices like cover crops, reduced tillage, no-till, and finally, on the bottom of the slide, talk about some of the edge of field practices like grass waterways. And some of the highlights, again, for those who can't see the small font or who are on the phone, is that 46 farmers out of 47 completed the survey this year. That's up from 30 farmers that did it in 2019, and 11 farmers did it in 2018. So the growth of your group is great. Year after year, it's pretty amazing. From those 46 farmers, farming 44,000 acres of land and 14,000 dairy cows and about 750 beef cattle. These numbers are up from 2019, where 30 members filled out the survey. Just to kind of highlight some of the practices, about half of the 46 members, 23, are doing cover crops, and that totaled about 10,800 acres. Fewer farmers in your group are doing reduced tillage, 17 of the 46 members, and a similar number, 17 other members, are doing no-till farming. So 34 of the members in total are doing some type of conservation tillage, either strip tillage, half, or the other half doing no-till. And acre-wise, that totals up to about 20,000 acres. So hats off to all of you for putting so much reduced tillage, on your farms or in the watersheds. And what these, again, there's other numbers on here. Nutrient management planning, again, is way up there, 33,000 acres. 2/3 of that is done by a qualified crop advisor, but a third of you, 12 of the 46 are probably qualified to write a nutrient management plan, and you're doing it for your farm. So So I guess one question I get is year after year, will these numbers have to keep going up and up and up? And I say they don't have to. It really depends on the purpose, the goals of the group. The goals might not be let's increase our membership year after year after year, but rather let's keep our membership and let's work on setting outcome measures or looking at other ways of increasing our presence through educational activities. Next slide, Jamie. And this next slide is giving an introduction into another type of analysis that I'll be describing using the numbers from the survey. And that's using the software tool that's utilized to do your nutrient management plans. And one of the outcomes from that nutrient management planning software is an example is the Wisconsin Phosphorus Index. And that's a measure via modeling uh, from a lot of different factors, both external and internal to your operation, to really get a sense of environmental impacts from your practices on your farm. And the P index, as is noted on the slide, is trying to illustrate how much pounds of phosphorus per acre per year is being delivered off of your field into the nearest surface water body, usually a stream or a river. And so ideally, we want the phosphorus index value to be very low. And the lower numbers would then recognize that you're keeping soil in place on your farm fields and you're keeping fertilizer such as manure or commercial fertilizer in place too from running off either as dissolved or particulate matter. So to create a nutrient management plan, next slide, Jamie. This slide is illustrating all of the components that go into a nutrient management plan. And what we do in these farmer-led groups is we take county-wide or averages for all of the values on the left-hand side of the slide in terms of, in other words, we don't have the nutrient management plans for every single farm of, say, the 46 farmers who returned the survey. We don't have all those plans to kind of create outcome measures of soil loss or phosphorus loss off fields on your farms, but rather we average or take county-wide estimates of things like what are the most prevalent crop rotations in your farmer-led group? What's an estimate of the manure that's being applied to fields in your group? Estimates of county-wide estimates of soil type, county estimates of how much field in Class C slopes, steeper slopes versus Class A slopes, which more are flatter land. Are you using contours or not, et cetera, et cetera. So we've taken a lot of, we've gotten a lot of information from members in your group to sort of come up with those averages. And from that, then we're able to make some, estimates of what kind of impact you are having in terms of surface runoff from your fields. Next slide, Jamie. Slide is a reminder to me to note that the crop rotations that are most common of the farm members of your group are dairy corn silage rotation, dairy corn silage with alfalfa. Third is continuous corn, and fourth is corn soybeans rotation. And the two practices, well, we honed in on three practices. One was cover crops. What are the impact of cover crops? Two, what are the impacts of reduced tillage? And three, what is the impact of low disturbance manure injection? Next slide, Jamie. And this next slide is another table. And it's a table that is illustrating that if you were a dairy farmer and had a corn silage rotation with no alfalfa in the rotation, um, here are some percent reductions and also soil loss reductions in tons of soil per acre per year with a variety of conservation practices. So just I'll walk through this a bit. The first row on the slide is sort of conventional practices. In other words, without any reduced tillage, without any cover crops, without low disturbance manure injection. Those would be the soil loss values in tons per acre per year on various slopes. Again, the CD slopes are the steeper slopes of 6% grade or higher. And so those slopes have the greater figure, 14 tons per acre per year is eroding off of a slope like that if you aren't using things like reduced tillage or cover crops, etc. On the flatter lands, flatter fields, which I have A slopes with conventional, with again, no conservation practices, your soil loss is about 2.5 tons per acre per year. The following 4 rows in this on this slide illustrate the really significant reductions in soil loss one could have on a farm. Again, a dairy, this is an example of a dairy farm with corn silage with putting conservation practices in place. So I will just illustrate one line. Let's illustrate a dairy farm using corn silage and using, say, no-till practices with a cover crop, the second line down. You would be reducing the soil loss from those fields by about 70%, depending again on the slope, but a significant reduction in soil by utilizing no-till and cover crops in that example. Now, we literally have these sets of tables for the rotations. I have only illustrating here dairy, corn, silage, but we have such a table for the other 3 rotations as well in terms of soil loss. And Jamie, next slide. And this next slide is another chart, and it's another illustration of the impact of conservation practices on surface runoff. In this sense, not soil running off the fields as the last slide, but phosphorus being delivered off the fields. And again, as was this slide really telling the same story as the last slide. In this case, it's a cash crop rotation. In other words, corn and soybean in the rotation over a 4-year period of time. And we're looking at P-index values. Again, a P-index value of 4.33 would be our starting point without any conservation practices. And that value, again, is about 4 pounds of phosphorus leaving the field per acre per year without any conservation practices. If one would put, again, no-till and cover crop in the rotation. In other words, all 4 years using no-till planting and putting a cover crop following the harvest of soy or corn in the fall. The P-index would, again, be significantly reduced. So a lot less phosphorus leaving your fields, staying within the soil, which is really, really key. Again, about 70% reduction in phosphorus. So maybe in summary is for all 4 rotations, and I've only illustrated 2, we fortunately see about a 60 to 70% reduction in surface runoff of soil or phosphorus with good conservation practices that your group is putting in place, as was illustrated on my very first slide of all the great conservation you're doing. hang on. And so I'm going to then, I've got a phone ringing. Go to the next slide, Jamie. And this slide is then gives us another way of talking about what was shown on those two charts. In other words, as illustrated here is we could do these, what I call scenario playing, based on all of the factors that we took to create these SNAP analysis. We can say that if you're a dairy farmer utilizing corn silage and you have a cover crop utilized in the fall, and if you had 715 acres of corn silage and you were putting a cover crop on it, you'd have this great reduction in 1,400 tons of soil. You'd prevent that from leaving your fields, as well as 1,400 pounds of phosphorus leaving your farm. And we can create scenarios just like that for other rotations, whether it's corn, soybean, and or continuous corn, or dairy corn silage with alfalfa. And in all cases, again, it depends on the acres of the field in practice. On this slide, we have illustrations with significant acres being utilized, 715 acres, for example, in the dairy farm rotation. Next slide, Jamie. The third factor that we can create and track through time is an indication of soil health, and that's a soil conditioning index. And what we can track through time with conservation practices is a metric on how your soil health is improving. And with these conservation practices of cover crops, reduced tillage, low disturbance manure injection, we're finding that those fields with such practices are increasing soil carbon, and in turn, increasing soil carbon increases soil organic matter. And as you all are well aware of, better than me, is when you improve soil health, you have all sorts of wonderful benefits that go with it in holding water, holding nutrients, holding carbon, maybe in time reducing fertilizer inputs because your soil has become more healthy. Jamie, finally, the last slide is just a thank you to all of you, farmers or advisors that are on today's call for, making the initiative, being those experimenters, those risk takers to try such practices, and then also to share such knowledge with all of your colleagues or fellow farmers in the area. And in conclusion, what I've presented here is a summary of some of the outcomes. First, a set of just basic participants and acres showing great increase in these practices over the last 3 years, which is wonderful. And that's wonderful to have that documented. And second, some modeling work based on the nutrient management planning software to give us a sense of what kind of impact your group is having in terms of reducing impacts on surface waters in terms of less soil erosion and less phosphorus erosion. I think the following presentation is going to be talking about groundwater and the impacts of nitrates on groundwater, and possibly in the years to come, you'll be looking at more of metrics to track that, as well as keeping these metrics that we're doing that I've shared with you in terms of the impacts on surface waters. So thank you all.